This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting the show is K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre and K-State PhD student in plant pathology Madison Kessler to talk about their recent research on how sudden death syndrome can be influenced. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, keeps today's show rolling, discussing Japanese beetles, burrowing bugs, and grasshoppers. He says what these insects are doing and how they can be controlled if needed. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk finishes the show by looking at the fluctuation in the Class 1 base price and how the price producers receive varies greatly from what the consumers see in the grocery store. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about a variety of things influencing sudden death syndrome. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre and a PhD student in plant pathology at K-State, Madison Kessler. Rodrigo, Madison, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you for an invitation. Thanks for having us here.
Yes, thank you so much.
Before we talk about this different research, Rodrigo, can you give us a reminder of what is sudden death syndrome?
Yeah, well, let me just start in saying that this project was funded by the Kansas Soybean Commission, right? So you as a grower are contributing towards this research, and we hope to bring back some valuable information for maximizing that yield. So back to sudden death syndrome, right? This disease is still like an emerging disease for us here in Kansas, which we have seen year after year an increase in importance and significance in terms of the yield impact that it's been causing, right? We see it especially in the northeast, but also southeast, central Kansas as well. We're starting to see a little bit more and moving towards west, right? Sudden death, as the name says, right, we start seeing some, I would say, infection and colonization happens at the emergence V1, V2, V3 early on in the season. But we don't see symptoms of this disease until the reproductive stage kicks in. So I would say the early that we see symptoms around R1, R2, R3, higher chance of yield impact we'll have, right? And as the name says, that sudden death comes in later when we start seeing some of those yellow sclerosis and necrotic tissue in the leaves. And it's a very interesting disease because the pathogen stays on that taproot, and it produces a toxin that's translocated in the xylem upwards, right, towards those leaves. And when that reaches the leaves, will cause this leaf sclerosis and necrosis that will eventually lead to defoliation, less pods, less seeds, and, of course, less yield, depending on that level of the infection, right? So, again, it's like a double-sided disease, right? So where infection and colonization happens early on in the season, but the symptoms actually only becomes evident later on. So our producers today, they face a lot of challenges because the management starts pre-planting, right? There's nothing much to do when we are in the season already. So that's why we're here today talking about the influence of row spacing, plant population, and variety selection on sudden death, right? Syndrome of soybeans, which is all the managements, again, like we're trying to define those or fine-tune those parameters before planting.
How was this research project set up?
So what we did here is kind of like talking with producers and understanding our cropping system in Kansas too. A lot of folks are starting to switch from 30 to 15-inch row spacing for several reasons. Being one of them, say, weed control, right? Trying to get that canopy cover as early as possible. So we're trying to understand, like, when narrow rows or different plant population, how is that affecting the disease side of the equation, right? So in this study, we did a 30-inch row spacing and a 15-inch row spacing, and we had 4 plant populations being a very low, like 80, 120, 160, and 200,000 seeds per acre. We also included a resistant variety and a susceptible variety to see how, under those circumstances, those like a resistance would play its role, right?
How was this then put together to see what works best or what maybe doesn't work so well for sudden death syndrome?
So this trial, actually, we did it in 2 locations in 2023, in Rossville and Kansas and Topeka, Kansas. But also, we also have a very good collaboration in Iowa with Darren Miller, which is a professor there, has done a lot of research with SDS itself. So we had like several locations for this protocol, and a lot of it's at planting, right? With our planters, we're putting inoculum down to just to try to increase those levels of disease in our research farms. But our planter, we can actually change plant population on the fly. So it was kind of like at planting setups, right? And row spacing as well. So everything is right there side by side. So it's a very exciting project that we have with the Kansas Soybean Commission here.
As you looked at row spacing, plant population, variety selection, what were some of the results?
So when we looked at the SDS index, we did this by looking at the foliar symptoms. So like Rodrigo said, the chlorosis and necrosis in the leaf tissue. We saw that the row spacing and our plant population didn't have a significant effect, but our resistant cultivar reduced SDS index in all of our row spacing and plant populations. We also looked at our root rot, and we did this by just digging up our plants and looking at the root necrosis occurring. And we saw that our cultivars and row spacing didn't have a significant effect, but our stand count and population are great predictors for this root rot. So as our stand count increases, we saw that our root rot also increased. And as our plant population increased, our root rot also increased.
So, Madison, as you're talking about SDS index, I guess the foliar disease and root rot data too, like, how did you do these evaluations?
So for the SDS index, we looked at the foliar symptoms and we assessed it based on a 1 to 9 scale, 1 being no symptoms and then 9 being premature defoliation. And so for the root rot, we dug up the soybean plants and we were just looking at the amount of root rot present because of SDS. And so overall, our main conclusions were that our resistant cultivars actually reduced our SDS index and increased our yield. We also had an increase in our root rot ratings with our higher plant populations. And then when we looked at the cultivar, plant population, and row spacing interaction altogether, this interaction actually was not significant.
As we've talked about this research, what are the really few key points that you'd like producers to keep with them?
I think, well, this was a very nice work done by Madison here, and again, like funded by the Kansas Soybean Commission, right? We're trying to understand, like, does plant population and row spacing matters when we're talking for SDS, right? And I think this research is showing us that yes, it does. And the more plants that we had per acre, more SDS we're seeing, right? So when we're trying to put this recommendation out there for our producers, right, managing SDS takes more than one tool, right? So if we have fields with higher SDS severity or higher levels of SDS that you're kind of like battling every year, I would say 1, wider rows, and 2, lower your plant population. I think that would be a really good way to help with the other management, such as seed treatment, planting date, right? We know if we plant too early, you're likely to have more disease. So again, like, it's kind of like managing SDS. We have to bring out, I would say, the more tools that we can for better yield and maximize that yield in our productivity.
Madison, Rodrigo, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was Kansas State University row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre, and he was joined by PhD student in plant pathology at K-State Madison Kessler as they talked about a variety of things influencing sudden death syndrome in soybeans. A great way to stay up to date with things like this happening in K-State's Department of Agronomy is to follow along with their e-updates. You can sign up for those by going to eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. I will, of course, link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain and USDA livestock analyst Shale Shagum as they talk about how most categories in USDA's latest quarterly hogs and pigs report showed year-over-year increases, yet producers are holding back in one category.
A year-over-year increase in U.S. hog and pig inventory. That is the forecast in USDA's latest quarterly revision. This is livestock analyst Shale Shagum.
The number of hogs and pigs on June 1st was 74.5 million head, which was up about 1.3% from a year ago, which gave us a market hog inventory of 68.5 million head, which was up 1.7%.
While those categories reflected rises from the previous year,
producers kept about 6 million head of breeding hogs, which was down 3.2% from a year ago.
farrowings and pigs per litter for the quarter were also up from the previous year.
During the period of March-May, producers farrowed about 2.9 million head of sows, which was just fractionally higher than a year ago. However, the number of pigs per litter during that period was at 11.56 pigs per litter, which was up about 2% from a year ago. That gave us a pig crop during that period of 34 million head, which was up 1.8% from a year ago.
Yet Shagam notes lower farrowing intentions for the next two quarter periods of the year.
We have seen some positive returns over the past couple of months for hog producers, which is probably getting them a bit excited about expansion. But on the other hand, we have seen some relatively weak hog prices in the past couple of months, which probably is injecting a little bit of caution in their thoughts going forward.
So what does this all mean from the perspective of potential pork production for the remainder of 2024?
As we take these pig crop numbers that we're seeing out into the second half of the year, which was most of them would be slaughter ready, we are looking at some higher slaughter numbers relative to a year earlier. And if you factor in the kind of weight growth we've been seeing recently, probably some higher pork production in the second half of 2024 relative to 2023.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain and USDA livestock analyst Shell Shagam. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but I'd like to remind you that if you're reaching your destination and aren't going to be able to hear the rest of today's show or have missed out on previous shows, you can always find them by going to agtoday.net or by searching Agriculture Today on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about insects and crops right now. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, first wanting to mention Japanese beetles.
Japanese beetles, yes. They used to be a serious problem in the I states, Illinois, Indiana, the states east of here, and then they moved into Missouri, and they have moved into Kansas probably in the last 10, 12 years, and they've moved in with a vengeance. Now they're probably pretty well established all the way to the eastern two-thirds of the state. And by well established, I mean they have, pretty good larval strongholds where the larvae are feeding, and then the adults come out. And the adults, the thing about the Japanese beetle, they have a wide host range, so they get into a lot of the ornamental or the horticultural plants first. Anything that's flowering or fruiting at the time when the adults emerge, the adults will feed on. But in agriculture, or as far as our crops go, there can be, and they have been, a problem, at least causing concern, in corn and soybeans. And again, it's all about timing. It's wherever the adults start emerging that the corn or the soybeans are in that state that it's attractive to them. As far as corn goes, and that's usually the crop that we have most concern with, because they'll feed on the silks. So if the sweet corn or field corn or whatever it is just putting out silks, just starting to tassel, got nice green, soft, succulent silks, the adult Japanese beetles will find them, and they start feeding. And they are very voracious feeders, and that's not normally true of most insects. Most insects feed most voraciously as larvae or immatures, but the Japanese beetle will feed quite a bit as an adult also. So they get into the silks, and we used to worry about adult rootworms feeding in the silks, but we pretty well know how to manage rootworms. So now it's the adult Japanese beetle. Oftentimes a green June beetle will be in there also, but it's Japanese beetle we worry about. They're a little bit larger. Therefore, they can eat more than the old rootworm adults. So if you have 5 or 6 adults feeding on the silks, the plants are just starting to pollinate. A lot of growers worry about whether that feeding damage and that silk clipping is going to interrupt pollination. And I have seen plants with 12 and 14 adult beetles feeding up there, and they do broom it off pretty well, or they keep those silks cut back pretty well, but not on a field-wide basis. Generally, where you have the biggest problem is on the side of the field where the larvae develop into pupae, and then the pupae develop into the adults. They're like us, they look for something to eat, but they're lazy, so they're going to fly to the shortest place where they find something that they can feed on. So they're mostly going to be on that side of the field from which the larvae were reared in. And the larvae will have been someplace where they're feeding on a perennial, like a turf or a grape or something like that. And then the adults come. The adults will feed 2 or 3 days, and then they'll leave and they'll go lay eggs. Then they will come back and they'll feed some more. And they'll do this for, 30 to 60 days. The thing is, during that period of time, the silks are maturing also. So once those silks accept pollen and start to turning a little bit brown, they're no longer acceptable to the adult Japanese beetle. So they will go elsewhere looking for pears, apples, grapes, or another cornfield, or that's oftentimes when they move into soybeans. They will feed on soybeans, but in soybeans they defoliate the plants. They feed on the leaves. If the plants are putting out, if they're in the vegetative state, they're putting out these nice green, tender, succulent leaves, the adult Japanese beetle then will feed on the leaves, and they can defoliate it. They can make it look pretty bad. But you got to remember, for soybeans are really resilient as far as defoliation goes during the vegetative stage. Unless it's 50 to 60 or maybe a little more percent defoliated, and that's not just one leaf, that's the whole plant, the plants will recover. They may make it look bad, they may defoliate it, and it looks like the plant's going to die. But again, those adults are going to fly away and go lay eggs, so they're only going to feed there for 2 or 3 days, and those plants are going to continue to put on foliage. So generally we don't recommend treating Japanese beetles, but in the last 3 or 4 years, they're really coming on. We're seeing more and more, and it's getting, that they cause more concern. So I just say hold off, make sure it's over the whole field, make sure you're sampling the whole field, and it's not just on one edge of the field. If it is, and it's to the point where you think the plants aren't going to pollinate if they're corn, or they're going to actually kill the plant as far as soybeans go, you can spray. There's several different insecticides that work pretty well, and you might just get by with spraying 1 round or 2 rounds on the side of the field where the larvae were produced. But the key to controlling Japanese beetles is to find where those larvae were. So wherever those adults go to lay eggs, that's where they're going to be the rest of the summer, the fall, and the winter, and come out next year. So that's the key, is trying to find where the larval infestation is.
And Jeff, is there a potential that growers are seeing burrowing bugs?
Yes, I get calls every year about burrowing bugs. The growers worry about them because they can be in great numbers, but it's always after they've sprayed the herbicide on the field to kill the weeds. A Roundup, spray the soybeans. Generally, that means if you have a lot of burrowing bugs, that means you've had a pretty good henbit infestation. That's the weed that they seem to like to hide under or feed on, or both. So once you round up your soybeans, these burrowing bugs, they have nothing else to feed on. They generally climb up on soybeans, and I've seen spots in soybean fields where there are literally thousands of burrowing bugs, on soybeans, and it gets the grower pretty nervous. I understand that. The thing is, I've never seen them do any damage. I mean, they'll do just a little bit of feeding, but they're just crawling up there, I think, to look for other weed sources, because basically they feed on weeds. The burrowing bug looks like it's shiny black. It's triangular shaped. The adult has a white border around its abdomen, around the shiny black top part of the abdomen. The immatures, they have a black-red mix. They're, again, pretty shiny, pretty vivid black and red color, but they're pretty well. I mean, you can see lots of them, and they really, I hesitate to say they won't do any damage. I've never seen them in 40 years do damage. And every year since they've had Roundup, I've gotten calls and I've gone out to look at burrowing bug infestations on soybeans, and they'll leave in 3 or 4 days on their own, even if you don't treat them. And I've never seen them leave a soybean patch where it actually died or had any negative impact on them. I hesitate to say that because that can always change, but as of now, we just don't recommend spraying for burrowing bugs. They do cause concern, but they're going to go away on their own. They're going to find another source of weeds and feed on those, and you won't see them anymore after this until next year when you have your soybeans and you spray them with Roundup. So that's, but they every year they do generate a lot of calls, even from an agronomist at K-State. They still get excited when they see there can be a lot of them, and they'll be on these little plants, and I understand the concern, but I've never seen them actually cause a problem.
Something else you sometimes receive calls about, grasshoppers.
Yeah, grasshoppers are our number one overall, in my opinion, pest in agriculture in Kansas because they feed on all of our crops. And by crops, I mean our pastures, anything we try and grow for livestock or for ourselves. Right now, grasshoppers, the eggs have been hatching. They're still hatching. The grasshoppers are growing. And they're starting to move out of the grassy areas or the weedy areas where the eggs were laid. So if you have a weedy spot in your field or beside the field where you have a lot of grasshoppers, they're just starting to move into the crop. So if you are concerned about it, right now is the time to spray. That way you can just spray the weedy areas, maybe 1 or 2 rounds beside that weedy area in the crop side of the field. That should take care of the grasshoppers. If you wait any more eggs are going to hatch. The grasshoppers, as they grow, they get more voracious. They feed more. As they get larger, they need more. So they can do a pretty good number on some crops, depending upon how many there are. But right now is the time. Like I said, they're just now starting to move out a little bit and get into the crop fields. I've seen 2 fields in the last week that were starting to show up, the crop fields that were starting to show grasshopper damage, and there were still grasshoppers in the brome waterways beside it. So it's a good time to get out and treat if you so desire.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about Japanese beetles, burrowing bugs, and grasshoppers.
Yes, my pleasure. Anytime. That
was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Since 2000, there have been some great changes in the Class 1 base price, causing fluctuation and volatility in the price per hundredweight paid to dairy farmers. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that consumers often believe the price they pay for a gallon of milk at the grocery store reflects the price that producers are being paid. However, data for milk markets in Kansas City, St. Louis, Denver, and Oklahoma City shows that's simply not the case. He says that's especially true for the Kansas City milk market.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some changes that we've been experiencing with the Class 1 base prices. As we look over the years back through 2000, we've seen great changes in Class 1 base milk prices. Been a lot of fluctuation and a lot of volatility. As you're well aware, we had an all-time high of $25.87 per hundredweight in June and July of 2022. That came after we had seen a very low price in 2019, as the Class 1 price then was only $11.42. So you can see a lot of fluctuation as we look to the more recent past. As we look into 23 and 24, milk prices for Class 1 have hovered between $18 and $20 per hundredweight. Now, there's not a lot that we can maybe do with that on our own dairy farms, but many times as you visit with your friends as they go to the grocery store and buy milk, they feel like milk price in the grocery store might be reflective of the price that you're getting on your farm. And there's been some interesting data tracked on that for some various markets. As we look at the markets from St. Louis, Denver, Oklahoma City, and as well as Kansas City, we've seen that there's been some changes over the last 10 years or so as far as how close does the price that consumers are paying in the store for whole milk reflect Class 1 fluid prices on the dairy farm. Back in about 2012 and previous, it was generally about $2 per gallon higher in the grocery store than what you were effectively receiving on the dairy farm, and that it held fairly stable at about the $2.50 per gallon range through about 2019. However, since that time, we've seen a very sharp increase, particularly in our Kansas City market, and now milk priced in the store is running about $4.50 a gallon higher than what you're being paid on the dairy farm. As we look at some other markets like St. Louis, there's been an increase, but it's still only about $3 a gallon higher than what Class 1 price is. The Denver and Oklahoma City markets tend to be just a little over $2 a gallon higher than what Class 1 price is, so maybe not as much change in those markets. So, how does the price in the grocery store relate to the price that you're seeing on your dairy farm? Well, that really depends on which market area that we are looking at. As we look at the Kansas City market, it tends to be higher than some of the other metropolitan areas here in the Midwest. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, letting our dairy farmers know that there have been some recent changes in the trends between the price of whole milk in the grocery store and what you're receiving for your milk on your dairy.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to Agriculture Today anytime, go to agtoday.net. There you can listen on demand, as well as find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other platforms. That's agtoday.net. Or you can also subscribe on your mobile device using any podcast app. Type the search terms Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. Simply tap the subscribe button and new episodes will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.